hope so. And man, is it fucking cold. Holy shit. I am freezing. Like, I don't want to turn the heat on because my heater works way too good. And it's great, but at the same time, it'll fucking make the house a goddamn sauna. So, not the greatest situation. So, we're going to go over some hands from yesterday and then jump into the next section of the Tournament Masterclass. I want to get back to it. Haven't been really on it for about a week, but I'm putting in a lot of play, so good to go. Hang on a sec here. I gotta fix the title. Shit. I forgot what episode this is. Hang on. I'm fixing it. What the hell is this? Alright, hang on. I gotta mute this. Sorry about that. That was weird. I got a call from the front office here. Apparently, Amazon delivered a package and never notified me. Motherfuckers. So, it's been sitting there for days. Great. Let me find the right title. Hang on one second. Videos. Where the hell are we? There it is. Edit. And do that. And this is number 83. And this is part 4. Okay, sorry about that. Alright, let's get into these hands. So pocket aces, a lot of these hands are just goofy ones that I marked for a video, so I don't know which one this is. I raised to 350, or 3.5, gets called. Oh, I remember this one. This is interesting because I'm experimenting with this. So I had a limper over here, and I thought maybe he was wanting to come in with something, so I made a standardized raised. Got only defended by the big blind, and there's not much for him to have here, right? Like he can have a king, I guess, if he defended, but there's not a lot here. So it's very early. We're very deep. So I decided to just check it back. Because if I had, like, let's say I had ace king here, right? One of my standardized moves is on ace king, I wouldn't bet here because it's just too scary, right? So I have to kind of slow play it. So I figured aces are better than that. So I checked it. Jack on the turn. Player bets half pot. This means nothing. And I said it out loud at the time. I'm like, this is just taking a shot. It's not polarized. It's not a draw. It's not anything. I think I said at the time I would be surprised if this guy had a pair. So I just call it. The river comes off a 6. There's a slim chance that somebody bet a 6 on the turn. So he bets, and I decide, you know what? It's great that it counterfeited hands like King Jack and King 3 and all like that. But there is a slight chance that he has a 6. And when he doesn't, what's he going to call me with? The only thing that really pisses me off if I call this bet is if he had something like King Jack and I decided to raise because I think that hand could call me, but I don't think he's ever got King Jack with that turn bet. So I just decided, you know what, this is one where I'm just going to call. This is the max value I'm going to get here without losing, and I turned out to be right. He had absolute airballs, and I ended up making, you know, a nice pot on this one. And it's just a little different way to play aces when you just have such a huge range and actual hand advantage. So I like the way I played it. Aces again. See a raise and a raise, and I remember that. This is just a funny one. So I 3-bet on the button, or on the small blind, pretty big. Big blind this was a snap bet. Like as soon as I clicked it, it was like 1 second, then he went bang, and he did like that. And I decided this guy's want to play for a 4-bet that much. Let's go ahead and jam it all in. I went ahead and landed 111 blinds in the pot, and had to fade a real bad board. But man, this was a nice one that took me very far in the tournament. And it's funny because this player again later, I played aces versus queens against him again, and then later I knocked him out with aces again. So it was just a funny situation. Pocket sixes. Oh, I remember this. So this player raised to 2.5, and this is that thing where if I had his stack, where if I had 25, 26 blinds and somebody raised, if I was going to play the sixes on the button, I would just be jamming, right? And it would be reasonable to do that. Because he's the effective stack, I decided to go ahead and jam anyway. The only real problem I run into is when I run into a hand behind, but not very likely. So I decided this is a good one to show off because it shows that effective stack play. You have to play off his stack, not your stack. So I just wanted to put this one in here for that example. Aces again. I believe this is the one where I eliminated the same guy. This is the same player with the queens, right? And he's got some chips back up. I 3-bet, he calls, flop comes off like that. I decide to go ahead and bet 3/4. If he's got something, he'll commit. He jam-a-lams, I call, and I had to yet again fade a monstrous draw. He could get, if we look, he was 56% on the flop, and on the turn, 45%. So I was never really that well off, you know what I mean? Pre-flop was my best moment, where I was 78%, and then it just dropped to 44, and then 55, and then, but thank God I pulled out the 100. So the same guy though, 3 huge hands against him, and it all went my way. Ace king, I decided to go ahead and make a 3-bet. Under the gun had opened. Gets called. This is a tricky one. So this is a super bad flop for all parties involved, pretty much. Like, pretty much nobody's got any of this. The most likely character to have some of this is on the button. But the guy under the gun, he could have the biggest pair, but he could also just have hands like ace queen, ace king. I obviously have the ace king, and being right in the middle. Like, if I was on the button, this is a different story, but being in the middle, I'm kind of fucked. Because, yeah, I can have 10s and jacks, but I can also have a whole lot of nothing. And there's 3 players in this pot, so I decide just to check back, and it checks around. And when the turn comes off and it makes the clubs and the 9s, now it's far less likely somebody has a 9. I believe if somebody has a full house, I'll hear about it. So, player under the gun checks, and I decide to make this bet. And this is just a simple 1/3 pot bet, and this is one of those ones where I should be betting this turn a lot, and I know that I don't, but because of that rule, I went with the low bet because of the high frequency that this board should hold, because nobody's really announced any strength. We can all kind of hurt each other. You know, they can both knock me out, and I can, you know, cripple them. And they both fold. And this is just one where the delayed C-bet worked better than the regular C-bet. So I like that hand. It was very nuanced. Player raises, I call. Here's another one of those hands similarly. 3-way pot, flop the ace. That's cool. This player then leads out from the big blind. And the thing about this is never an ace. Like, 100% never an ace. So what is it? It's usually a draw, right? It could be a draw like 9-10. It could be a draw like 5-6. It could be something like 8-9 or 8-10 or 7-9, 7-10, 7-6. It's just never an ace. So I'm ahead, depending on what this other player does. Now, this other player just calls. The problem here is this bet, this donk lead, is confusing. Because remember, this is a raised pot. So this player raised, then I called, then the guy in the big blind defended, then he led into both of us. This is the weakest position on the table, leading into us. So what he's saying, what he thinks he's saying, is I have 2 pair. Now the truth of the matter is, if you had 2 pair here, you would want to bet big. You'd want to bet like 3/4 pot here. Not because you're worried about draws, but because somebody with an ace should go off, right? So if you make a bet of like 6 or 7 blinds, and this guy actually has ace queen, he's just going to pile the money in. But this bet just kind of is like a semi-tester. If nobody has an ace, I can take it. Plus, I have some equity. I want to get to the turn. You know what I'm saying? I felt like he wanted to get to the next card. So I decided in this particular instance, because I don't know what this guy's doing, because he hasn't had a chance to show what he's doing, I'm just going to call, because my jack is not the greatest kicker. Deuce on the turn, total brick. Player now bets out super small, and I'm like, okay, this has gone far enough now. This player has absolutely confirmed for me he does not have an ace. He does not have two pair. At best case scenario, he has a draw, and that draw needs to be charged. So I went ahead and piled it for about 3/4 pot, and it was really, really a nice bet because it wasn't overly big, but it was big enough to make a point. At this point, if this player calls this bet, he kind of has to call a big bet on the river if he only has one pair. This player, he'll just be piling the money in. The initial donker folds, and this guy folds. And I said at the time, after this guy folds, if this guy jams it in, I think I'm 50-50. Like, I honestly don't know, because ace queen and ace king would have re-raised, so I felt like we were either chopping or I was beating like ace 10. But then again, he could be free rolling me with the suited ace of hearts. So it was a real dangerous spot, but I like that I didn't risk too much to make my point. And took down a nice pot, and it was really well thought out, I thought. This is an interesting one, just because of the situational things that happen. So I raise, under the gun calls, big blind calls. The flop's usually good for my range, so I go ahead and bet. I also have the ace of spades, so I can bluff later. I bet pretty hefty, a little bit over half pot, almost 2/3. And I decide this is the move because I'm just going to slam one time and try to take this pot down. As player calls, he's not likely to have ace king. And in video, when the queen came off, I said, well, this is the perfect card for me to keep betting, and I don't think I can fold if I decide to bet here because of the spade draw. But there is a very good chance, or there's a pretty good chance that my opponent has exactly king queen. And when he does have that, I'm going to have 11 outs. So we can go. I decided to go ahead and bet. He does jam in. Of course, it cost me 9 blinds to win. What is this? 18, 36, 37, 43, 53 blinds. So obviously we're not folding at 5-1. I call and make the nuts, and my opponent did in fact have king queen. And it's just a situational thing where we were 7-handed, and in all honesty, I really think he could have 3-bet or folded this one. Like, it's just one of those things. If the queen didn't hit the turn, and I keep piling money into this pot, are you happy going broke with king queen? If that's the case, this is the kind of forward thinking that will allow you to play the hand perfectly pre-flop and either fold it or jam it. If you're not comfortable losing with one pair here, you should just fold. Now, am I saying he should have folded on the flop? No. But I do think it was a great case for him to make a small 3-bet just to define his hand. But it was kind of sketchy. We both were at 30-ish blinds, so hard to say. All right, let's go on to the next one. This is the next facing a bet example on a monotone flop, queen 10-5. Tried to do this one, but wasn't focused the other day. So let me make sure the sound is on. Can we... Come on. What is it? Yep, there we go.
Now let's discuss queen of spades, 10 of spades, 5 of spades. This nasty spot from before. So under the gun +1 raises. We call the big blind. Flop comes queen 10-5 all spades. We check, then under the gun +1 bets a 3rd pot. All right, first things first. How do we even approach this? Well, let's go through and add the obviously strong hands to our premium made hand range. Understanding, though, that in this scenario, we're going to want to do a lot of work to strengthen our check calling range. And the reason we want to strengthen our check calling range here is because if you think about who has the nut advantage, it's going to be our opponent, right? Because they're going to raise all the good suited ace-x and the good suited king-x from early position, right? So our opponent actually should have a decent number of flushes in their range, which means they're going to be somewhat inclined to bluff the turn in the river a lot if they don't actually have a made hand. So, in that scenario, you want to really strengthen your check calling.
So this is one of those ones where once you learn how to do it, you can kind of manipulate these when you are the pre-flop aggressor. So he's under the gun +1, so obviously, you know, like you said, all the flushes are in his range. All the aces of that suit are in his range. And they're not really in ours. I mean, the you know, weaker flushes are, but like we don't have the ace king of spades, right? I mean, it's not even on the chart as an option because we would 3-bet it. Ace queen, sure, that can be there, but that's not 100% either. There can definitely be a ton of other suited aces in our range, but seeing how he's raising out of first, he's more likely to have it. It's just a range thing. So when this player bets, he can either bet value or he can just be betting bluffs, and it's the same size bet. So this is one where, since you're out of position, you actually can do well out of position because in position, the other player might or do things that will screw you up, like leading into you on this board. You know, if you were the raiser and stuff like that, can really fuck you up if you're in position, like if these spots are reversed. So I actually don't mind this flop out of position as much as I do in position, because it actually leaves me with more information. Plus, when I call bets or when I check raise, my moves are so much stronger on this fucking board because it is such a scary ass board. So not one of the ones I hate out of position.
Strategy. And you also don't want to be check raising into a range that should be quite strong on average. So let's raise our sets, let's raise our 2 pairs, and let's raise our weak flushes and see what we're looking at.
It's pretty linear. Like, and on these situations, when you check raise, you're probably getting the money in. I mean, even with the weak flushes, unless you have like just the bottom barrel 4 deuce, you know, 6-4 kind of flushes, pretty much anything 9 high flush or better, you're going to try to get the money in because, you know, there's only you have to have exactly the suited cards, and there's only the ace, king, and jack left above you, so you need some combination of those, and there's far less combinations of those than there are of, you know, the 9 suited on down. So, which is in our range, you know, versus the other player's range, specifically on this flop. So these are check raise linears where you're just probably going to pile the money in. If you're at 40 big blinds, you're not really folding a flush at 40 big blinds. If you have the smaller ones, it's a good spot to just call, because when they back off, because here's 2 things. One, they may back off on the turn, right? So if the turn comes the deuce of diamonds and you've called a flop bet and the turn goes check, check, and then the river comes off and it's the 4 of clubs. Now, if you check it, you can induce a bluff from a player or value bet if you think they have it, right? Or they might just have the ace of spades. They might decide to go for that big bluff. Or what I like to do in these situations a lot is one of 2 things. I go for a polarized betting strategy, which is I will either overbet it. So if there is, let's see, what would there be? 2.5, 5, 6.5 on the flop. So he bets a third, so about 2.25. So that's like 4.5, so 5. So there'd be like 11 in the pot, right? And I'd have 29 behind. I might just bet 18 here, 18 blinds into an 11 big blind pot, because it just looks like such bullshit that players with a queen will hero call you. I've actually been hero called by guys with second pair here, or even an under pair of like 9s or something. Or the other one, which I'm trying to integrate more, which is an interesting move, and there is a Jedi mind trick. I think it's number 4. It has Yoda on the thumbnail that shows when I really understood why this move worked well on a Jonathan Little video, and it kind of broke my brain. And I did the move that night, where I had this hand that was super strong. I couldn't have raised at any point before the river, and then on the river came out, and let's say there's 11 blinds in the pot, and just betting like 2 blinds, just 2 flat, no 2.25, no, just 2, and then letting the opponent's time ticks a ton, and then they make this huge overbet, and it's usually all in. So there's like 11 in the pot, I bet 2, and the player has, you know, 38 behind, or what does he have, like 36 behind. You're actually going to see them jam all in, and it's scary. But every time I've seen it, and I've done it dozens of times now over the past month and a half or so, I've snap called it and gotten paid every time. It's taken me to final tables. Just these crazy big blind scenarios where you just goaded the bluff. And it's like they don't just raise small. Like when they raise small, I've seen that happen a few times. They usually have the marginal ones that need more value. Like they think I'm setting the price for showdown when in truth I'm trying to get them to raise. Usually I'm winning those too, but usually they have a hand like two pair in a situation like this or a set. And it's like if I have a flush, I beat them. If I don't have a flush, I don't beat them. There's no real reason to raise it because they're not going to call unless I'm beat by a higher flush. Very weird betting pattern, though, for a higher flush to be out there. But it's just one of those interesting scenarios where the big blind kind of has a lot of control because we have a huge nut advantage when the turn goes check, check, but a huge nut advantage when the betting continues on the flop. Oh, wait a minute.
Looking at here. All right, now let's find some bluffs when we are out of position. I don't think you want to have a ton of bluffs in this spot, again, just because we're raising into what should be a very strong range. When you are raising into a strong range, you want to make sure that the draws you have are either quite junky or pretty strong. In this
Plus, we're out of position. And when you're out of position, generally, you're just going to check more.
scenario is kind of neat, though, because our value raising range is actually very, very good, right? It's two pair and better, which is quite strong. Therefore, our draws can be a little bit junkier. Like if we raise Jack 9 offsuit and get re-raised, we just easily fold, right? And if we check raise with any flush and we get re-raised or a set or two pair and we get jammed on, we easily call. Now, if we were deeper stacked, like say 100 big blinds, we'd have to be even more cautious raising with two pair type hands, because then if we get action, if our opponent re-raises or whatnot, we're often in not such great shape. Okay, so we know we're going to raise something like this. We have to be a little bit cautious. We know we're going to be overfolding, right? So don't worry about that. We want to make sure we're calling with hands that have decent equity, though. And that's usually going to be hands like top pairs, middle pairs, bottom pairs even. Although some of the weaker bottom pairs here can probably just be folded in reality, like we saw on some of the previous boards. And we're going to be calling with the ace of spades blank, right? Ace of spades blank is quite a strong hand. And I think this strategy is reasonable. If you wanted to bluff a little bit more, I think it's fine. But you're going to see that you actually have kind of a tough time finding logical bluffs that you actually like to bluff. Because I mean,
and here's the thing: those ace of spades rag hands where you have one card that makes you the nut flush. The reason why check raising those isn't great on 40 big blinds is because you're giving the player an escape hatch. Because realistically, he's the guy that should have the ace of spades, right? Because he raised preflop. So if he's c-betting this flop and you just call it, he may think he can represent the ace of spades even after the spade comes out and you call. Now you're going to have to do some timing shenanigans where you're going to have to seem like you're hemming and hawing over a call on the turn or, pause a long time before checking the river. But at the same time, you want to give the person a chance to bluff at you like that. If you check raise it, the first thing everybody says is, oh, this dude's just holding the ace of spades. That's it. And they just pile all in with, a king, queen or something here. And then you just have to hit your hand. And anytime you have to hit a card to win, that's called gambling. And we're not trying to gamble. It also allows you this. Let's say you call on the flop, the turn goes check, check, and the river comes off, and it didn't do anything to the board. Now you can actually make a really big bet with the ace of spades in your hand because you have it in your hand. You know where the ace of spades is. So therefore, he can't have the nuts. He absolutely cannot have the nuts on board because he can't have the ace of spades. So you're allowed to make this big bluff on the end because you could have just been trapping it the whole time. And since he doesn't have the ace of spades, even if he has a baby flush, it's not an easy call. And he's rarely going to have a baby flush when he stops betting on the turn. You know what I'm saying? He's not going to have the suited king jack of spades, or the the king nine of spades or something like that under the gun +1. He's just not going to have too many flushes that are going to just be like, oh, he made a bet, so I have to call here. You know what I'm saying? There's no automatics. It even gets tough when you have like king queen or something. Ace queen I think is a snap call a lot, but a lot of players even will fold that if you make the bet big enough. Like on the river, that stack's going to be like $11 or 11 blinds in the pot. If you bet like 9 or 8.5, something like that, and it just looks so crazy, you might even bet bigger, just to overbet bluff. it really kind of fucks the other player up because they don't know where the ace of spades is.
Think about it. Like, what actually wants to bluff in this spot? Like 9-7 with a spade. I mean, that seems pretty optimistic, right? I mean, it's really hard to find additional bluffs that make logical sense because we're already using some like king highs with a spade and open-ended straight draws, and it's pretty difficult to find any more. So let's take a look at what we are doing in this scenario according to the solver. Solver likes to fold 46% of the time. I was suggesting 49%, so looks about right. Solver opts to raise with queen 10, 10s, 5s, 10, 5. Doesn't actually raise queen 5 for some reason, which is interesting. And it calls basically every other top pair. It also raises with a smattering of flushes, which is what these small sliver of suited hands are. So that's neat. And again, it also picks these bottom pair type hands to check raise as bluffs, as we saw Solver does some portion of the time as well. So that's kind of neat. And then some sporadic ace of spades X and king of spades X, right? Notice king jack raises sometimes and calls sometimes. Jack 9 raises sometimes and calls sometimes. So, you know, mixes it up. But you see the fold percentage is roughly the same. It does 35% calling. Let's see what I was doing. Oh, good. 35% calling and 18% raising. So raising a bit more than I am. So it's probably taking some hands that I'm folding in here and raising them some small sliver of the time. But I think this strategy is perfectly fine and viable. So notice here that I was raising mostly low flushes, right? Let's take a look at this flushes the solver is mostly raising. It's looks like it's just straight and mixed up here, right? It's raising some ace highs, some king highs. Again, kind of convoluted strategy here. Notice ace of spades X and king of spades X is raising sometimes, calling sometimes, right? Again, very, very mixed strategy, and that's why it's difficult to play like the solver. Take a look at this, though. 9 of spades X, 8 of spades X. Solver does actually raise these some portion of the time, which feels really aggressive to me. But that's what the solver does.
But the solver finds little slivers where there's like backdoor straight draws and things like that. And plus, on a missed pot, a 9 could be good. You know what I'm saying? Where you make a pair on the turn or something.
I mean, look, I even had a 9 of spades X here. This actually shows you why it's difficult to play like the solver. You have to ask, do you think your opponents are actually going to be raising 9 of spades X on queen 10, 5? 3 spades? It's like, no, right? So if they're not raising as often, that should result in you continuation betting a little bit more often when you are the pre-flop aggressor. So anyway, this is what solver recommends, and it lines up pretty nicely with what I recommend, just going through the logical strategy. And again, I think it's important to note that in the scenario, you do really want to strengthen your checking and calling range. Otherwise, you're going to be check folding way too often. And a nice way to do that is to just add more premium hands to your calling strategy, which means you're going to have fewer premium raises. But that's fine because we want to make sure our checking and calling range is somewhat strong when we're out of position. All right.
Plus, having fewer premium raises, meaning your flushes and your bottom two pairs and things like that. This board is easy to see. You know what I'm saying? Flushes are easy to see. So your premium hands are actually less likely to get paid off. So if you throw some of those into the checking range, you know, you're not exactly trapping. You're more so, it's kind of like value checking. Like if you were to bet now, you throw all the value away when you're good, and you just torch yourself when you're bad. But if you check, it's kind of like you're saying, my hand's only good enough for 2 streets of value. You know what I'm saying? And then based on what the player does on the next turn or on the next card, you may decide it's only good for 1 street of value on the river. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of what I would think of as a value check, because your hand is not as valuable because it's so easy to spot. You know, it's like having 4 cards to it's like you raised ace king pre-flop and the flop came out queen 10 jack. Everybody can see that. Everybody goes to ace king right away. So if you just start piling money into the pot, players are going to just fuck right off. You know what I'm saying? But by checking there, you're then trapping, but you're also allowing it to be a value check because you didn't c-bet the flop. It may put the seed in the other player's head that you have some fear of ace king, like you may have, ace queen or something, you know. So just an interesting side note, the value check.
But where are we here? We raise the button, big blind calls. Okay. Same story, right? We're going to be betting just our absolute best hands and our lower flushes. I think that is viable in this scenario. After we face a bet, going through and balancing it out with draws again. We have to be a little bit cautious raising with draws because notice now we actually lack even more of the ace of spades, ace of spades, X of spades, whereas our opponent has all of them. So we're going to be lacking the nut advantage a decent amount here. We're again picking some random ace of spades, X, and king of spades, X to bluff. King jack bluffs. Jack 9 could probably bluff here. I think that'd be reasonable too. I have no problem with that. In reality, probably should just raise. I think that's reasonable. That would up this number a little bit, which is fine. Folding 43%, calling 44%. Let's see what solver does. So solver actually...
Those things change, like check raising the ace of spades X when you're in the big blind or defending versus the button, because you both have an equal shot at having the ace. You know what I'm saying? In the first example where it was under the gun +1, the under the gun +1 has more chance to have the ace of spades than you should, because you randomly are playing your hand. You got dealt 2 cards, got a price you could defend, and are going to defend 70% of hands. Your opponent is more likely to enter the pot when the ace of spades is in his hand, because if you pair it with a jack or higher, he's going to raise. If you pair it with a suited, another spade, he's going to raise. If you pair it with another ace, he's going to raise. So he's the one who's more likely to have it. When you're in the big blind versus the button, neither one is kind of more likely to have the ace of spades. So check raising there makes more sense because he's less likely to have the ace of spades, and he knows that. So you can be check raising a pair. You could be check raising 2 pair. You could be check raising anything, so you're going to be check raising a lot more value hands than you are the ace of spades flush draw, and because of that you're going to get more folds, and that's why it makes it a much better spot to raise, because the ranges pre-flop are not as strong. They're evened out.
Folds a little bit less than I do, and it calls a little bit more, so it actually is finding some of our folds and calling with them. King 8 of spades, this was an oversight, my bad. This clearly should have been a marginal made hand for the spade, so I can mess that up a little bit. Find some calls, though. I mean, goodness gracious. How often is solver calling? 44. So solver's calling more. It's raising only 9. So it's raising a little bit less than I am, which is interesting. So it's raising a little bit less, calling a little bit more. Look, if you do what I do, it's probably just reasonable because the numbers line up nicely enough. But so solver...
I think the solver is raising less because this is a scenario where when it comes out all spades, both players, button versus big blind, are likely to have far more combinations of every spade. Like the under the gun +1 guy, him raising, he's not going to have jack 10 of spades. He's just going to fold that. You know what I'm saying? He's not even going to open it because it can't take any heat. So, but if you're on the button, you can raise the, any suited spade face. So you can open with jack deuce of spades. You know what I'm saying? You can open 10-9 of spades, 10-7 of spades. You can open 6-7 of spades. You can open up every suited connected combo of spades in the deck, probably all the way down to deuce tray, honestly. So the reason why the solver isn't raising as many of your flushes is because of 2 factors. One, if you flopped a flush, this is a scenario where your opponent's more likely to have also flopped a flush. So checking some of your lower flushes and betting your premium flushes is not exactly a great idea because the other player is going to have flushes too. So when you bet the queen of high, or if you have the jack, 8 of spades in your hand and you flop the flush here and you check raise and get a ton of action, it's more likely that your opponent also has a flush. Now, there are more combinations that are below your jack than above it, so that's good. But at the same time, you might want to add that to your checking range because, 1, you don't want to pile money into a situation where you're just drawing dead, and 2, you don't want to scare off somebody who just has a baby flush. You know what I'm saying? Like a 4-5 or something that was there on the button. It gets tricky when playing those hands, but I think that's why the solver checks more premiums in this scenario, because both players are just as likely to have flushes.
Raises sporadic king X and ace X with a spade. Raises 2 pair. It's raising a little bit more bottom pairs. Maybe this is just an adjustment we should consider doing across the board, is just check raising some weak bad pairs out of bottom pairs out of position. I think that's probably reasonable. Notice again, solver's check calling a lot of the good strong flush cards. Solver check calls king 9 a lot of the time, which is interesting. Notice this king 9 check calls. I'm not sure what I did with it. Oh, I was calling it too. Well, I was folding some of the king 9, so maybe that's a little bit of the error. Because, I mean, solver literally check calls all king 9s here, which means king of hearts, 9 of diamonds at check calls. Seems pretty loose to me and difficult to defend, but that's what it's doing. All right. Let's take a look at this scenario. Under the gun plus raises, we call on the button. Queen 10-5, betting.
So now the same opening range, but we're in position. Big different factor.
Just our nuts, right? Also still checking some flushes. This is that scenario where we need to be calling a ton, because remember, we are in position now, right? When we are in position, we really don't want to be raising a whole lot because we want to call, go to the turn, and see what develops. So this is a spot where we're not going to be folding more than the minimum defense frequency. Notice we're calling 30%. Actually, we still are folding a little bit more than minimum defense frequency, right? A touch more, but I think that's fine. We're doing a lot of calling, only raising with the effective nut hands that are susceptible to being outdrawn. That's going to be 2-pair and low flushes. And we're raising with just a few bluffs. And notice the bluffs that we're raising here are really junky, because if we raise like Jack 9 offsuit and our opponent jams, we can just fold, right? When your raising range is tiny, by the way, notice here it's only 9% of hands that I'm using at least. I think it's perfectly viable to not raise with any of them and just call with all of that stuff instead. I think that's very reasonable. We could widen our raising range a little bit more, but notice we don't really have a ton of bluffs. We could raise these weaker flush draws. Or sorry, weaker flushes. I think that would be viable, but really it only gives us a few more combinations. So I guess we could raise King Jack then, all King Jacks. I think that's probably okay. But again, we want to really strengthen our calling range here. And notice this 70-30 ratio is very important when we are in position, because we want to make sure that we are defending at least a decent chunk of the time. Otherwise, we're going to be folding vastly more than minimum defense frequency, and minimum defense frequency does become at least a relevant concept when we are in position. So we want to strengthen our calling range here because we actually do have a lot of junk. Like King 6 of clubs is clearly junk here, right? So when you have a lot of junk, you must strengthen your calling range when you're in position. Very important point. Notice solver raises, well, basically never. Ha! Look at that, almost none. Calls 67, folds 29, same numbers I had. So that lines up pretty nicely. And it makes logical sense because we're in position, our range is weak, and therefore in turn we don't really want to do a lot of raising. We want to do a lot of calling because otherwise we'd be drastically overfolding. And you see solver calls a ton, right? Like King Jack calls, right? Doesn't even raise King Jack. Jack 9 doesn't even raise. Solver doesn't raise. And like I said here, when your raising range is naturally very small, you might as well just call with all of it. But like right here, we certainly could take some of these marginal hands and turn them into draws to raise, but that would make our marginal maiden range weaker.
I mean, the only real... I think the only real raises that exist here are the strong hands that don't mind getting the money in. If somebody raises under the gun +1 and I have, a set or top 2 pair on this one, I'm get it in, man. Like at 40 big blinds, because what am I going to do? Just call and then let a spade come off or not know where the fuck I'm at or just look super strong. Like if a player raised under the gun +1 and if for some reason at 40 big blinds I just called on the button, which is possible if the big blind was very aggressive and maybe I wanted to get him but he didn't go. I think just raising here is fine because you're going to get the ace of spades to pile it in on you. You're going to get somebody with a good pair, aces or kings, to pile it in on you. And you're just going to want to get it in with that set right there. So I think that's the only real raises the solver should have. The 8-7 of spades and 8-6 of spades are good raises, I guess, because it allows for enough cards like the King Jack and Ace in your opponent's hand of spades that will take a card off, but aren't exactly always crushing you with the made flush. So that makes sense, but there's not a lot.
If you look at the draws or the junk we're folding, it's all of these backdoor... it's all these like non-spade hands, right? And you really don't want to be raising a bunch of really junky non-spade hands. So, neat scenario. With these hands, by the way, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, 4s, 3s, 2s, I'm only continuing if I have a spade. That's why these are selected. You may find that to be a little bit tight, but I think you should be folding in this spot if you do have an underpair to the 10. And that's because if your opponent just bets the turn, you pretty much always lose. And even if you check it down, you very often lose as well. And the problem here is that if it does check on the turn and your opponent bets the river, you can't really call these bad underpairs, and you're just going to have a very, very difficult time realizing your equity. I don't know what the solver did, but so the solver actually did do the same thing, right? It's folding when it doesn't have a spade. And I think that's probably a good strategy here, because even though these hands appear decently strong, you need to have the foresight to know that they're going to realize equity very poorly. And when you're going to realize your equity very poorly, you should probably get out of the way, even when you're in position.
Interesting. Very interesting scenario. 40 big blinds deep, should you raise your 2-pair sets on a monotone board when you're in the big blind facing a bet? Yeah. That's the situation we just talked about. Pile the money in, you had 40 big blinds. You'd rather get it in when you're most likely best. When you're on the button facing a bet from under the gun +1, and this is the board, should you raise when you have the nut flush? No. Because you have the nuts. No. Fairly straightforward. Let's go on to the next section.
Now let's take a look at Jack 6-2. So under the gun +1 raises, we call from the big blind. Flop comes Jack 6-2. You check, under the gun +1 bets 33% pot. You should know we are going to be at a pretty big disadvantage on this board, both in terms of range advantage and nut advantage. And therefore, we're not going to be doing much raising at all, right? So given we're not going to be doing much raising at all, this is another one of these spots where I think it's probably viable to not have a huge raising range. That said, it's probably fine enough to raise whenever we should be raising, what is this, 14% of the time? It's probably enough to justify trying to find the raises. So the obvious raises here are good top pairs and better. And you may say, are good top pairs and better really good enough to raise and get it in against under the gun? And it's unfortunate playing 40 big blinds deep that you have to get it in with like queen jack and king jack, but the answer is yes. If we were deeper stacked, we would be less inclined to raise with these decent top pair hands.
There is a wrinkle here. If you're playing very low or very high, like if you're playing buy-ins of $200 or more, or you're playing buy-ins of $20 or less, I don't think that holds true as much, because you're not going to get enough folds when you're playing lower versus hands that can outdraw you, and you're not going to get enough calls at the higher levels versus hands that you beat. With the top pair, queen jack, king jack. That being said, yesterday I was in this exact scenario almost, where I raised the queen jack, or the guy raised the queen jack, or king jack, and this was almost the exact flop. It was like jack 7-3, and I had the queen jack in the cutoff, and he had opened, in the big blind, and he had opened from under the gun +2. And the flop came off like that, and I was like at 30 blinds, and I check raised, and he called, and I jammed the turn, and he thought for a long time, and then he did call it off with the king jack, and my queen jack was no good. But I think this generally is a true statement about getting it in with the top pair good kicker, ace king, ace jack, ace or ace jack and king jack. But there's exceptions. And of course, you're going to have to adjust no matter what tournament you're in. Just a side note.
Because then, like say we're 100 big blinds deep, we don't want to get it in with king jack or even ace jack on jack 6-2. Although you'll usually find that top pair, top kicker is a hand that's just good enough to raise and get your money in. And then we're also going to raise with draws, but what are draws on king 6-2? That's usually going to be stuff like the gut shots. So you see 5-4, 5-3, 4-3. Also stuff like overcards and backdoor flush draws, which we have selected, right? One overcard hands with backdoor flush draws makes a lot of sense. And notice that has us already pretty much balanced out. We're folding 47%, which actually feels kind of high here to me, but this is just one of these boards that's very uncoordinated, and we're going to have a pretty tough time connecting. And like, we don't really want to be check calling with queen 10 offsuit, and we can't really justify raising it because we don't have enough nut hands. So this is a spot where I don't think we're going to be raising a ton. We're going to be raising some, but not a ton. And we have to do a lot of calling here, I think. So solver actually raises more than I do. Notice 22%. I was raising 14%. Let's find other hands that solver opts to raise. Random ace highs with backdoor draws, okay. Ace 3 with backdoor draws, okay. Bottom pairs, sometimes 4-2 randomly check raises a lot. Again, that was something we're seeing as a pattern, that random bottom pairs sporadically check raise. Notice these gut shots check raise a lot.
I think the reason why the solver comes up with the random check raise with bottom pair is because it's kind of an unblocker. Like if you have 4 deuce, right, and you're defending in the big blind, how likely are you, to have 6 deuce or jack deuce? You're just as likely. So by holding one of those paired cards, you kind of unblock one combination that can be beating you, like a hand like ace deuce or something like that. And when you put in the check raise, a weaker hand like a bottom 2 pair would actually do that. So, and you do have the outs to get there with 2 pair of trips on the turn. I had a hand like this yesterday with 6-3, where I went for the check raise because I thought the player was playing a pure move, and he called me and I made the 6 on the turn, where I had trip 6s now, and decided to go check check, and on the river he led into me, and I was able to raise and get a call, whereas if I hadn't hit the 6, I would have bet the turn and bet the river and most likely gotten him off of the weak hand. I think he had something like top pair middle kicker, but my hand just looked like such utter bullshit that it was either trips or nothing, and it just so happened to be trips. So I think that's why the solver check raises bottom pair sometimes, because it's kind of an unblocker situation. It makes it less likely that the other player has pieces of the board, and since you already have half of 2 pair, one of 2 pair, you could definitely go with it. And plus hands like 4 deuce and 4-3 and 3 and deuce 3, they also have backdoor straight draws. So there's a lot of turns to pick up equity. I've been trying to figure it out as to why the solver does that, but through this course, you'll see this example over and over and over again, where Jonathan Little ends up saying, I don't understand why the solver is check raising bottom pair, but I think it's an adjustment we need to make. So I just made the adjustment and then kind of logicked out why the solver would come up with that. And in all honesty, I've had very good results. So I got to say it's definitely viable, check raising bottom pair in the big blind in these scenarios sometimes, especially when you don't have the range advantage, but you can have a nut advantage with junk cards. You know what I'm saying? Somebody raises and they're making it 2 big blinds. You can defend fucking super wide, and people know that. So when you check raise, they're just gonna go fucking 2 pair, and they're just gonna throw away a pair of 10s here very easily.
6-4, kind of a weird check raise. 6-4 and 6-5 are kind of odd to me. Random jack 5, jack 4, jack 3, but not queen. Oh, I'm sorry, these are top pairs. So solver actually check raises top pair even more than I do. So that's interesting to note, right? Solver thinks top pair is just good enough to get in. I will say that another adjustment you're definitely going to want to make is that I think the solver is a little bit more happy to get it all in on very uncoordinated boards with top pair, because it presumes the opponent's going to stack off with just a lot of pair hands, right? Because minimum defense frequency and whatnot. But I think generic recreational live players don't, well, especially live players and players in general, aren't going to mindlessly stack off with any 6 here or like pocket 5s here. They're just going to fold every time when they get raised. So for that reason, I think you probably don't want to be raising these jacks, even though they are likely the best hand. I think you'd much rather call and induce bluffs. I think when you check call against most players today, they're at least going to continue bluffing on some turns.
Yeah.
Whereas when you check raise, that's going to take away their chance to bluff. And you don't really want to be check raising with decently strong bluff catchers if your opponents are going to play appropriately against that or appropriately enough. So in this scenario, if anything, I want to check raise more often with bluffs, because I want to put my opponent in bad spots where they may overfold. So I'm not in love with this strategy, even though I see solver doing it. I understand why. Solver assumes the opponent stacks off way wider than I think generic players stack off. Interesting to see like middle pairs check raising though. Maybe in this scenario it presumes like bottom pair is not quite good enough to check raise. Notice it calls a lot of those, whereas it's check raising these sometimes. Bizarre strategy, right? But anyway, it's folding 44%. I was folding 47%, so that lines up pretty nicely. It was calling 33, I was calling a little bit more, and it was raising a little bit more. So basically, some of my...
See, and things like that, like where the solver is more likely to get it in with just top pair any kicker, it's not implementable because, you know, people aren't solvers. But a solver versus a solver would do that because having, you know, Jack 4 here beats hands like 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 5s, 4s, which on the other side of the solver would call off or would call a check raise with like pocket 9s or 10s, which a human being very rarely will, because they are aware of the fact that they are super vulnerable and it's not just a math problem. You know, it's implementable versus GTO.
My calls, solver opts to use as a raise, which is fine. You know, strategies line up close enough. All right, button raises, you call from the big blind, Jack 6-2, facing a small bet again. Here we want to check raise a little bit wider with top pairs. This now makes a lot of logical sense, to me at least, because we're going to be against a wider range, so now the opponent actually should defend wider. This is a spot where the opponent will continuation bet pretty frequently. We should be folding less often, I think, because the opponent's range is wider to begin with too, so that's going to result in us calling more often. So let's take a look at this range here. We have top pairs raising. We have all the 6s, some of the jacks, all the 2s, all the aces, or the majority of the aces calling, aces with overcard to a 6, or a backdoor draw. And then I have myself calling with some of these king high and queen highs out of position. I know this feels a little bit murky. I'm interested to see what the solver does here, but this is, I think, required. You also could raise with the queen 10, I suppose. Notice I'm raising like queen 9 and these low backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw type hands. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I know it feels bad check calling out of position with queen 10, but in order to not just be drastically overfolding in this scenario, I think it's probably required. And when I say overfolding here, it's important to note that like the ranges are a little bit closer in this spot when we're against the button, right? So when we're against under the gun, we're at a huge disadvantage, and we should be folding a lot. I mean, I'll go back over here, right? I was folding 47% against under the gun, but I'm folding 37% against button, and that's because I know that we need to call more often against the button, even though we're out of position, even though we're going to realize equity kind of poorly. Like king high is actually good here a lot of the time against the button, whereas it's like never good against under the gun. So let's see what solver does. I was raising 21, calling 41. Oh, look at this. Sometimes it just works out. Raising 21, calling 42, folding 36. So basically exact same numbers as me, so that's nice. Sometimes you're lucky. So raising good top pairs, like I was doing, right? Raising lots of backdoor, well, some backdoor flush draws. It elects to use only when you have an overcard to a jack, whereas I was using some of these junky ones. Let's see if it's using junky ones. It does use some junky ones as well with backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. Notice solver uses backdoor flush draw and backdoor straight draw as opposed to just one overcard, right? Like it's folding 10-3 backdoor draw, but it's raising 9-7 backdoor draw or 10-9 backdoor draw because it also has backdoor straight draw. Yeah, backdoor straight draw too, right? So having additional outs that you can continue barreling on is very, very important. We're going to see that when we look at turn strategy later. Never folds a pair, right? Which makes logical sense. Folds out bad ace highs and king highs and queen highs and all that, which makes sense. But good. I mean, anytime you see your numbers just line up perfectly with the solver and the hands you're using lines up pretty well with it, you got to be happy enough with that. Now let's take a look at button against under the gun +1. So flop comes Jack 6-2, under the gun +1 bets using a 2/3 pot size bet. So kind of big. This is a spot where ranges start to be kind of close to the point that the opponent should not be betting all the time, right? And for that reason, they're using a bigger bet size. And when they're using a bigger bet size, you in turn need to do a whole lot more calling.
So this is a concept that I've been hammering home because it came up in the tournament masterclass about 3 weeks ago. Frequency, meaning how often, right? On this flop, as the under the gun +1 raiser, your range is not going to connect with this board, meaning being improved by this board, as often as the player in the big blind is going to be improved by it. So you can't just make a simple 1/3 pot bet because let's say you do have a hand that's not improved by this board but is still ahead. What hands do you have? Aces, kings, queens, right? Even if you have ace king and your opponent is improved by this board, meaning they've made a pair, they are now ahead of you. So betting 1/3 pot and a guy sitting there with 6-5 is not going to fold. But since the board does not hit your hand as, this isn't what it means, but this is how I think of it, as frequently, your frequency of betting should be lower, meaning you should be betting less of the time. When you're betting less of the time, you're investing less money over time, so therefore you're allowed to raise the size of your bet. And we're only using 1/3 and 2/3 pot bets. We're not using half pot bets. So, because we want to stay polarized. So, if I'm the under the gun +1 raiser on this board does not help my range as much as it is the big blinds range. So, I'm not betting it as frequently. So, when I am betting it, I'm betting it bigger. Because I'm saying, under the gun +1, I open, I have a good hand. This flop comes down to get checked to. I still have a good hand, sir. I have an overpair. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and bet. So therefore, when he has a jack, I'm going to get a lot from him. And when he has a hand like a 6 or a 5 and decides to call and I continue betting on the turn, I'm going to get a lot from him. I'm going to charge him to beat me, right? And if he doesn't check raise, usually I can keep doing that all the way down. Just go 2/3, 2/3, 2/3 and be good, you know? That being said, on a board that did connect, like if it came off ace, queen, 5 or whatever, all the aces and queens are in my range. So I'm going to bet that flop a lot from under the gun +1. So therefore, since it has a high frequency of times I'm going to bet, the bet can be lower. So I will invest the same amount of money over time. So greater frequency, lower bet. Lower frequency like this one, higher bet. And that's just a point to drive home. It really clarifies when and what size betting you should make. And here's the thing. The frequency is lower, meaning you're not going to bet this every time you raise from under the gun +1, which means when you see this flop, don't just think, oh, this is a low frequency board, so I have to bet it higher. No, there's a lot of checks in there. There's a lot of checks in there. There's a lot of times where you have a hand like ace-king and the player checked and you're like, meh, my ace-king's going to be good a lot here, so I'm just going to check. And then you check and then the turn checks. And then you know, the river comes off and your opponent bets and the board hasn't really changed too much. You can actually call with the ace high and get some showdown value. You know what I'm saying? It's only really when you think you're either A, going to get the fold from the big blind a lot because they're kind of passive and they kind of give up very often on the flop. That's when you're going to look to bet these more often. So you're going to bet with a worse hand more often. Or when you have a hand you want to protect. You know what I'm saying? So like when you actually have the, you know, the pair of tens, you know what I'm saying? Or something like that, or better, where, yeah, you don't beat a jack, but he's not as likely to have a jack, so I can bet my tens and protect them and get value. So there has to be some checks in here.
Notice in this spot we actually lack draws against a decently strong range completely. So whenever we don't really have many draws whatsoever, we should start folding out our junky draws. And also we don't have very many nut hands either, right? Notice our only nut hands here we want to raise against under the gun +1 and get it in with are hands like ace, jack, 6s, and 2s, and jacks. That's not all that many combinations, right? So this is another one of these instances where the solver is going to raise some small portion of the time, but not very often. And that's because it doesn't really have very many made hands, premium made hands, and it also doesn't have very many draws, right? So when the solver lacks premium made hands and obvious draws, it's going to do a lot of calling. And notice in this spot, again, we're defending a very, very high portion of the time. That's because these ranges are very, very similar in this scenario.
See, and this shows you that even though the ranges are so similar, you end up with calls and folds. Your strategy becomes very linear because you're on the button and you're in position. Being in position carries that much weight that there's not even any reason to raise premium hands, like, you know, sets here like that, because you're going to get to see the board and see what he does first, and you're going to get him to just pile money into you. The amount of times I've been in a situation like this and just hit the call button 3 times and gotten a guy's whole stack, it's fucking staggering. And it's only amazing if you don't consider how powerful position is. And on the button, you are in the ultimate power position.
Think similar enough. So we call 78, fold 21. Solver raises, as you see, basically never. When it does raise, it's raising top pairs and sporadic bluffs, but again, almost no bluffs. Solver folds 31. I was folding 21. So Solver actually folds more than me. Let's see what it's folding that I'm not. It's folding all these hands. Folds king 7, king 5, most bad ace highs. So, where's it folding where I'm not? Let's see. Ace 9 and ace 8. So here's where it's folding where I wasn't. It's folding ace 9 backdoor draw, but I was not folding ace 9 backdoor draw. So, sure, I mean, that makes some logical sense. That said, one thing I will definitely tell you to do in tournaments is to float, call a flop bet in position a lot with the idea of picking up the pot on the turn. That's a topic we will be discussing later, I'm sure. But this concept is referred to as floating. Whenever you are facing a bet, you call with a decently wide range with the idea that I'm either going to make the best hand by the river or I'm going to bluff a decent amount of the time by the river, or maybe just win at the showdown. And maybe I'm overestimating the amount of showdown value ace 9, ace 8, ace 7 has in this situation. It's probably what's happening. So if I'm overestimating the value of those, then that's going to result in me calling with these a decent amount more often. Notice this is 9 combinations of hands. So if I took 9 combinations from marginal mate and added it to junk, that would make our ratios a little bit better if in line with the solver. But again, I'm fine with the strategy. Big takeaway from this, though, is that notice we're not actually in great shape here, even though it is kind of close. And for that reason, we, in turn, don't really want to be doing a lot of raising. And the hands that we would like to raise for value, like ace-jack, king-jack, etc., are not actually that great if our opponent, under the gun +1, wants to put their whole stack in.
Interesting stuff. I think the thing with the ace 9 and all like that, and the ace 8 that the solver misses, is that the variable between the showdown value there is not as great as the solver continues to believe. So like your ace 9 has some showdown value with just ace high, but the solver doesn't account for the fact that you're up against a lot of ace highs under the gun +1, and those ace highs beat you. It kind of removes way too many combinations, I find, because the player under the gun +1 can have ace 9 if it's suited. So the solver kind of removes that if you have ace 9, which is an interesting mistake, but you can see it's just mostly calls. The raising with ace jack top pair, like it's a slice to raise half pot, but I still don't like it too much because it's one of those way ahead or way behind situations, So interesting. Big blind facing a button 1/3 pot bet on this. Should you raise or call with hands like queen jack? You're most likely raising. Top pair is usually good enough. Big blind versus button. It's very strong versus the button's super wide range, so yeah. When you're a big blind placing a 1/3 pot bet on this, what the following type of hands are best to bluff. Backdoor straight flush draws like 8-5 and 7-5 suited. Low pairs like that are too weak to call, like 10 deuce. Junk hands like this. I think these two, it's the choice, but I think we're going to go with the low pair here because yeah, I just like the check raise more with some equity. No, it was the back door. Okay. I guess that makes sense because our equity is kind of capped, meaning we only have to improve with a 10 or a deuce. And these other ones we can improve with a pair or a straight or flush card coming off. So that makes sense. I overthought it. I got to admit I'm a little tired. Yeah, it's fine. That's why the quizzes are there. We're going to mark this as complete. I want to see what the next section is. All right, this is the next example, facing a bet on Jack 6-6. This is going to come up a ton. This is where the bottom pair is lower than the top pair. Very different when you're on the button versus the big blind. If it comes off like King 6, different story. We already went through that example. Fun stuff. Let's get into it next time. We've gone for a little over an hour now. I think this is a good place to stop. I'm probably playing today. I will say I don't think I'm playing tournaments, but I do feel like playing a ton. So I'm probably going to have 2 or 3 cash game sessions today. I am doing the $100 to $1,000 cash game challenge. We're about 9 sessions in, and I'm up like 14 or 15 buy-ins, something like that, which is pretty good. Had a little backslide a couple days ago for like 8 blinds or 8 buy-ins. But being up 15 buy-ins in 9 sessions is pretty good online, considering it took me a little while to get my feet wet. I still think I can achieve the $1,000 in like 30 sessions, just because after I get to like 500, I'm going to be adding higher limits, going to 20 NL, and I can start brushing up on 50 NL when I get to like 8 or 900. So I think it's doable. We'll just have to see what games are available and, how I feel and how I do. But I think 30 sessions is reasonable at this pace. I mean, that's only 3 buy-ins a session, on average, playing only 10 NL. So very doable. And I'm a little behind that pace now, but, I'm okay. Had 1 losing session, so no big deal. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up for now. Check out all the stuff on YouTube, guys. This stuff and the cash game challenges are all posted on YouTube, plus all the final tables. I'm making new content. I'm editing stuff. I'm kind of looking for inspiration to put my next video together. But I think I'm just going to pick some of my favorite movies and maybe do a highlight reel. Fuck it, why not? And yeah, let's have some fun today, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks for coming out.